it's very important to be clear about what mistakes the conflict model makes. The first mistake that it makes is it says science and religion explore the universe and give answers in exactly the same way. Therefore, if they differ, one must be right and one must be wrong. The trouble is that the universe is a lot more complicated than that. Let me use a silly illustration. What is the scientific definition of a kiss? A kiss is the approach of two pairs of lips, the reciprocal transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes, and the juxtaposition of an orbicular muscle in a state of contraction. That is a kiss in scientific terms. But if I go to my wife and say to her, Alison, let me get together with you for a mutual transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes, let me juxtapose my orbicular muscle in a state of contraction with yours, she would say, get lost. You see, in that context with my wife, the scientific description is true, but it's not sufficient. There are other ways to describe a kiss in terms of value and purpose and love, which are complementary. And in fact, to fully understand a kiss, I need both a scientific definition and an understanding in terms of value, purpose, and love.
The 18th century English theologian John Wesley emphasized the four sources of truth in theology. It's a position that's come to be known as the Wesleyan quadrilateral. He listed experience, reason, scripture, and tradition. The relative balance between the four sides of the quadrilateral has changed over time. It also varies among denominations, and I would even say depending on the pastoral situation that one is dealing with. One finds, for example, among evangelicals, a greater emphasis on Scripture. Among Anglicans and Roman Catholics, an emphasis on tradition. Among charismatics and Pentecostals, an emphasis on experience. And among philosophers and Presbyterians, I can say this since I grew up Presbyterian, a greater emphasis on reason.
You start off, what, with a big bang, nothing conscious, no values, no complexity, no organization. That's how things start. And now, where we've got to, about 14,000 million years later in the history of the universe, we've got consciousness, we've got purpose, people having purposes, people thinking, people loving, people relating to each other, people being morally free. Well, if that's not an improvement, it's hard to know what is. It is a development of consciousness, of intelligence, of awareness, and of freedom. So looking at the cosmic history of the universe, just as a plain, ordinary scientist, it's hard not to think that this is actually some sort of direction or progress. And the direction is towards greater consciousness, greater freedom, greater thought, greater awareness. That could well suggest to you that the universe is itself the product of a great intelligence or consciousness which has this end in mind.
Why 600,000 species, or whatever the number is? It's about that. Of beetles. Did God especially like beetles? No. It was just a question of freedom in creation. Evolution occurred, and a wide variety of species resulted from that. Why do more than half the species of Drosophila, it's a little fly, exist in one part of the world, Hawaii? And the question can be asked why. They're all closely related to each other. There's very strong evidence to indicate that those species of flies all descended from one or two organisms, perhaps, or at least a single species. I would say that it's because God in freedom, the Hawaiian Islands popped up, and as a result of volcanic activity, and some flies arrived there, and evolution occurred, and we now have hundreds of species of Drosophila, different species of Drosophila, at that one particular spot in the world. Why 168 species of elephant that have existed, except 2 of which have now gone extinct? The rest went extinct over the last 30 million years or so. Why? Surely the answer to all of this is that creation has enjoyed a certain freedom, just as we do.
Now, one of the biggest issues in understanding human nature within the context of theology and neuroscience is the question of how many essential parts am I composed of? Am I a body and a soul, a body and a mind, a body, a mind, and a soul? Or how about a body, a mind, a soul, and a spirit? Am I a unitary being, or am I controlled by some kind of a committee?
Every story that science has to tell ends eventually in futility or in death. That's obviously true of us as human beings. We all know we're going to die on a timescale of a few tens of years. It's even true of the universe itself. The whole universe is going to die on a much longer timescale, of course, many tens of billions of years, but eventually it's all going to end in futility, most probably in a world that is getting more and more dilute, more and more cold. And it is as certain as anything that all carbon-based life anywhere in the universe will eventually disappear. That's the story that science has to tell. From the point of view of a physicist like myself, that futility is due to the second law of thermodynamics, which essentially says that as time goes by, things get more and more disorderly. Glasses get broken, but you never see glasses reassembled. From the point of view of a biologist, it's due to the fact that we live in an evolving world. And in an evolving world, the death of one generation is the necessary cost of the new life of the next generation. So we live in a world that is condemned to futility and death as far as the story that science can tell is concerned. But science only tells one story. It tells a horizontal story of the unfolding of present process according to the way things happen today. Theology has a different story to tell. It tells a vertical story of God's relationship to creation and essentially of God's faithfulness. And that story can have a different ending. It isn't condemned to futility. The faithfulness of God can mean that there is a destiny awaiting us beyond our deaths, and indeed a destiny for the whole of creation awaiting beyond the death of the universe.
A third item on our list of hard choices arising out of the advance of genetic research is the distinction between therapy and enhancement. We just talked about how we could splice in genes for a future child. We might select out diseases or genes that predispose to disease, but what if we want to select in or splice in genes for increased intelligence, musical talent, or the ability to think theologically? I think that would be a great gene to splice into somebody's genome. Will that difference between therapy and enhancement call for a different moral logic? And if it does, where will we draw the line between therapy and enhancement? That's kind of hard to do. And will there be an economic justice coming out of this issue coming out of this, because the wealthier people are more likely to be able to take advantage of genetic services, and their children are going to do better in the schools. In fact, we might end up with schools for the genetically enhanced children and ordinary schools for the others. We've got some serious public policy issues coming down the pike.
We tend to think that all of this bounty that God has created is only for us, for human beings. But if you continue in Psalm 104, it makes it very clear that God is concerned with continual provision for all of the created order. In verse 10, you make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills, giving drink to every wild animal. The wild asses quench their thirst. By the streams, the birds of the air have their habitation. They sing among the branches. And then skipping down to verse 19, you have made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness, and it is night, when all the animals of the forest come creeping out.
Yes.
I love
Isn't
that.
Great?
We go to sleep, they come out, we each have our place. There's harmony. It's just beautiful.